Thanks so much for having me. I find most every person in the ports and shipping industry has some pretty interesting story on how they got into the industry. Nobody wanders into ports and shipping the way they might wander into retail or manufacturing or even consulting. I don't know why that is. I think at least, where I grew up, people just don't talk about ports and shipping that much. Hopefully that's different in Halifax. Hopefully this community kind of gets the importance of the port, but I find it always takes some shock to get people to get it. I actually grew up 10 miles from the port of LA Long Beach, and I still have 20 years of McKinsey in trade and transport and logistics. Never really got that much into ports and shipping until I moved to Chile 5 years ago. And when I was in Chile, it's this, tough economy, remote part of the world, very dependent on imports and exports to be successful. And ocean transport meant the world to that economy, right? It was actually the difference between green lighting and not green lighting projects and communities and things like that. So I got fascinated by the industry, have been ever since as I've moved into Asia and Europe and done work all over the world. And now I'm back in the US. McKinsey's been pretty heavily invested in the ports and shipping industry globally. We do a lot of work in this space, and there's really three main reasons. Right? One is, as I said, we find it critical to the global economy and all the clients we serve. Two, as I said, it's really important for local communities. And three, I think, we in our kind of self-confident moments, we love to deal with messy problems, right? We aspire to not just be kind of working on the most important problems, but the really, really messy ones. And this sector has a lot of messy problems, right? For that reason, this is really an industry that we spend a lot of time on. And on behalf of myself and the whole practice, we're really excited to be here, and thanks for having us. I'm going to set a little bit of context. I mean, all of this is going to be stuff that you know, but I think it's important for a conversation on kind of opportunities in ports and shipping to set a bit of context. Anytime you talk about this industry, you got to talk a little bit about volume. So many good things come from volume in this sector. Growth is important in every industry, but it's especially important here where you've got so much of your cost of production tied up in these big fixed assets, right? And so, growth is always where it starts. And where are we doing on growth, right? So, sorry for the fancy, complicated, pretty page. The McKinsey folks love making pretty pages, but what you've always seen, at least since kind of us have been in this industry, is really good long-term growth. Maybe some short-term cyclicality, but good steady growth, like since the 80s. Right? If you take this chart back to early mid-80s, you'd see 2.5 to 4 multipliers from GDP to trade volumes. Right? And that kind of became the conventional wisdom that that's what you get. Well, what you've seen since the recession is that multiplier has come down pretty dramatically, right? Now you're in like 1 to 2, which is basically, exchange is not happening quite as much. So not only has the economy slowed down, but you're not getting the multiplier of trade. And so volumes are light. And everyone's facing that in the industry. Right? If I hadn't one of my economist buddies, they could spend the next hour talking about what we see going forward and is it going to get back or not. The short answer is nobody knows. Most of us think that the odds of the global economy getting back to a place where you're getting 2x or more multiples on GDP are unlikely, right? At least not in the near term. The question then is kind of if with volumes down, sort of what's happening with economics, right? So what we've seen in sort of the last 5 years, this is a global view, but terminal utilization and ROICs are significantly down. Right? I'm sure you're feeling that in some ways in terms of utilization, but from where you were in sort of the early 2000s pre-recession to where we've been in the last 5 years, global utilization significantly down and returns on invested capital accordingly. Right? This is all kind of context. I'm sure you guys know this. So I'm gonna move to stuff that I think is more interesting. The the question is sort of what are players doing, in this environment, right? Because that's the sort of context that you can't control, right? The overall GDP and trade volume. I know we can try and stimulate new manufacturing and things like that, but it's hard. So what are the industry players doing? Well, at sea, right? We all know carriers are buying more and bigger vessels. Right? Not exactly the obvious thing you want to do when demand is down, but we know the story there, right? The individual economics of the individual vessels for each player make a lot of sense, and so you do it. Ports and cities are investing in dredging and new cranes and new berths. Again, not exactly what you want to be doing in a time of low demand, but every community wants to be part of those larger vessels, and everyone's doing that. The carriers are getting into the big, messy, complicated VSAs to help kind of fill the big vessels. To fund that, they're making some cuts. They're getting out of chassis. They're doing some things on their staff levels, and a lot of that complication, right? A lot of the complexity is moving inland, right? It's moving to the ports. It's moving upstream. It's moving to the trucking, right? It's moving to managing chassis pools and the like. So actually, a lot more complexity. None of this net is improving the economics, right? Because most of the fuel savings is just being passed on price savings. But you got kind of this tough spot that we're in where the volumes are not going to come save us, and it's gotten challenging because of some of the decisions that have been made, right? Does this sound roughly right? This is a global view, and I know Halifax is quite a bit different, but so what I wanted to spend more time on is how do we see BCOs and shippers sort of responding? Right? So we spent some time last year, and I'll do the classic. I'm sure a million Americans have done this to this audience, but we spent some time talking to about 40 shippers and shipper organizations across North America. The vast majority of them were American. So sorry, I do not have a deep perspective on the Canada-specific view. But we spoke to shippers, forwarders, retail foundation, about 40 interviews, and then we hosted a roundtable at TPM in Long Beach last year. And what we heard was pretty interesting. As context, right, shippers over the last 5 years, we've run the math, BCO and shippers globally have saved about $23 billion in freight rate reductions in the last 5 years. Right? So you'd think that'd be pretty awesome news, right? They're not a very happy bunch, right? Normally that much money would sort of make everything good, right? But they don't feel they're getting the service they need. They don't see the transparency in particular on what's coming down the pike and how do I know when a problem's coming and how can I, ideally you're solving it before it's a problem, but at the very least, how do you communicate with me what's going on? They actually don't complain that much about slow steaming and time in transit. Now there's obviously the odd exception that says, look, the slow steaming has impacted my supply chain, I've got more inventory, but generally you don't hear them saying that, right? Which leads me to think that time in transit sometimes is exaggerated in terms of criticality, but what you hear is there's not enough reliability, I can't count on it, I can't get transparency. And interestingly, they're frustrated because they don't feel like they're to blame for the rate problems, right? Like, I'm not, the shippers will tell me, I'm not the one out there driving down rates, right? It's the carriers or it's the forwarders or it's someone else. But it tells me that you got a group out there of BCOs and shippers that are frustrated with what they're seeing globally. Right? That's one complication. Right? I'd say the other complication is that I don't think they're just venting. Right? I mean, there may have been a time where it's just kind of noise in the system, and look, I'd like better service, but there's a lot of investments being made by a lot of players, big and small, to say, look, we want more control over this. There's a ton of startups. I've got colleagues in sort of the private equity space that do analytics on, how much PE activity by industry, and they'd say what's going on in transport right now looks like sort of media and music kind of 10 years ago. Right? There's a lot of PE-funded investments in analytic firms, tracking, intervention-type stuffs. TrackSense is a company that was cargo ocean-based that CMA and MSC are backing. So there's a lot going on the left, and I'm sure you guys have heard a ton about like what Amazon in particular is doing. That they're making huge investments and putting real assets and long-term leases in place to actually be able to control and deliver much more of their goods all the way to the end customer. And the question is why. I mean, I think, especially on the Amazon side, if you take that side, you'd say it's one of three reasons. Right? Either they're just trying to drive out costs. They see logistics and supply chain as a strategic part of their value proposition, and they want to make sure they got it. Or the third is just some broad world domination, strategy. Right? I'm not sure if it's two or three. I've actually had good debates as to whether they want to be, UPS plus, Maersk plus, do they want to do that someday? Doesn't look like it to me right now, but who knows? I think it's pretty clear it's not just cost, right? I think it's an investment in figuring out, hey, this is a strategic part of our business. We want to be really good at this. We want to be able to differentiate on the ability to get stuff there faster, more reliably, cheaper, right? And so, I share these things around what the shipper's doing is because I think it presents, I think it presents opportunities to think about, what could you be doing, what could port communities be doing to better drive growth in this context. The old sort of conventional wisdom, I think, and I call it then, right, was sort of a buyer mentality. Right? I've heard C-level executives in the ports and shipping space say, look, customers are going to leave you for $20 a box, so you got to do everything you possibly can to drive down costs. I've heard sales executives in the space say, look, I cannot get to the C-level folks. I can't actually make a value pitch because I'm just talking to this buyer and it's just rate. Right? And I think that was sort of true. I think 10 years ago that was true. I think it is changing, right? And I think it's changing because of it's becoming a more strategic part of everyone's business. It's becoming easier and easier to sell and market, through all sorts of new online but getting stuff from A to B is still hard. And so I think what we're seeing more now is, people want a sort of what we call a total cost of ownership solution, right? They're actually not just looking at the cost per lift or the rate of demurrage or the freight rate. They're actually looking, how do I look across my whole thing, across my whole supply chain, including complexity, including all the things that I have to handle versus someone else. I think they're ready for a value proposition that's more than rate and about more how do I solve your solutions. And so if I were to think about Halifax, and this is where I'm way ahead of my skis because I don't know, I'm not deep at all in Halifax, so please forgive me. But I thought I'd be, I don't know if provocative, but just throw out some ideas, right? I think that the Port of Halifax could be in a great position for what I see as this shift. Right? I think this shift is to say, look, I want a more integrated solution. I'm not going to just talk about volume and scale and rate. And I say that for three reasons. I hear great things about the history of collaboration. I mean, even the table I'm sitting at today, like collaboration across kind of public and private and management and labor and carriers and ports. I think you've already invested in some tools around transparency, which feel really well aligned with the kind of things we're hearing from shippers. And I do think that the game of reliability, ease of use is a game that you're better positioned to compete in than the game of just pure kind of slot costs and how big can you roll in the vessel and let New York do that. So in that context, I wanted to share a few sort of specific ideas, right? And sort of grouped in three areas, right? One is about the customer experience. One is loosely what I'll call commercial excellence, but talk about sort of how we get in front of to drive more cargo, and then collaboration across stakeholders. So customer experience, right? Like I said, I spent some time with the app. I think it's a pretty nice tool. Frankly, we've been doing a lot of work globally in this space in Europe on figuring out how do you create these kind of applications and tools to let people get more information. I got a team that's probably looked across the world at 40 of these. And I'm not kidding, the quote I got from one of them was probably the most easy to use mobile solution we've seen. So whoever kind of led and developed that, I mean, kudos. Love the fact that you're kind of trying to take responsibility for one source of information versus, everyone's got a different data point. And I think that's hard, but like exactly the right thing you should be doing. And then just, it's got good, easy information on it. I think a couple of opportunities to really push it would be get even more end-to-end, right? Think about how do you loop in trucking and rail and really make it a connected sort of full supply chain visibility tool. And then the other one is I would think, how can you leverage sort of the best today in sort of big data and machine learning to make it more predictive? What we see in this space is there's a lot of garbage in, garbage out, right? And so, I didn't go deep enough, and I don't know what you're dealing with today, but one of the things we found is that you can use a lot of public data and a lot of machine learning these days and advanced analytics to actually get forecasting some of this stuff, and it can be really reliable. I want to share an example of something that we've been doing recently on big data, and this is this Navimeter tool. But this is really focused on a very specific problem felt in the ports and shipping space, which is around how the heck do I estimate when these vessels are going to arrive, right? And so we were working with a terminal operator that was just saying, look, there's two problems today, right? One is it's this brutal manual process of calling all the time, and then they're calling their captains, and I'm trying to get data, and everyone's kind of exaggerating a little bit, and I'm not that accurate. And for me to schedule a gang or line up facilities or line up trucking based on a bad forecast is killing me on cost. It's time consuming. And with them, we built a tool that said, okay, well, there's a ton of public data out there. There's GPS data for where every vessel in the world has to carry GPS-enabled tracking to say where is it. And you combine that with history, you combine that with weather, you combine that with where that vessel is in its line against others. And we actually just collectively built a tool that predicted when they would arrive. Right? And it's actually really accurate. Right? This is just an example of kind of how the machine is learning. This is a relatively new tool that we're piloting with a number of different ports and port authorities. But it's already more accurate than the captain's estimates that we had. And by the way, this was the work we were doing was in one of those situations where you do have collaboration between carriers and ports. And so you'd think the communication would be as good as you can get, and yet still taking almost the human touch out and using facts and data and analytics gave a lot better forecasts. And so this is a very narrow application, but in terms of pushing your thinking on how could you use big data and analytics to really bring together a more insightful, more predictive view, and start to do even proactive problem solving to improve flow. So there's some thoughts on customer experience. I mean, the next category would be commercial excellence, and I've got three thoughts there. One is market planning, and it's a pretty kind of not that exciting of a term, but I think if we go back to the earliest pages, with sort of the GDP forecasts. Those big, dumb global averages are really inaccurate, right? Because where you don't compete in the whole world, right? You compete in tires, right? In Eastern Canada, right? I mean, you compete in specific industries in specific places with specific destinations. Your position on kind of on the way to New York from Suez in Europe, it defines a really good space for you. So get detailed into what are the actual industries that are in that sort of space. Because what we see a lot is that the growth projections and the growth realities for some things are wildly different than the average. So the first thing would just be get into the market planning. The second thing, and this is always a sensitive topic, but I think everyone in this sector has got to get better at selling together, right? And I mean carriers, authorities, terminal operators, trucking companies, rail. I think to the point earlier that it used to be sort of a one-off negotiation, my rate per lift, my rate per box. I think that's not what people want anymore. I think you can get, maybe not to the C-suite, but you can have conversations with the head of supply chain, but you need to be bringing the whole solution together. I don't know where you are on that journey, but I would imagine there's an opportunity to make sure that you're really putting one face together and getting the most out of that. And then the third idea is what we call tiered pricing. This is actually something we've been studying a lot and wrote an article on this year, some Danish colleagues of mine. But the basic perspective is that pricing in our sector is pretty simplistic. We don't differentiate a whole lot on this berth versus that berth, night versus day, big ship versus small ship, right? I mean, I think we've fallen too often into the trap of sort of a flat fee per lift. I'm saying this globally. I actually haven't looked at your rate sheets, so forgive me. But what we're finding is that there's a lot of this waste in the system that is tied to poor communications, poor collaboration between parties. And putting some actual pricing agreements in place has helped drive out waste. So a couple of examples, right? So like we saw a port put in extra fees for unattended truck windows, right? I mean, if you've got a slot and you're not showing up, there's a fee for that. Premium for late and alternate time zones, right? Not time zones, sorry, times of day, right? This is especially important in places where you're really at peak capacity. I think in places like New York where you're trying to figure out how to shift people to off times. So at the current time, maybe not the biggest lever here, but I think really just thinking about where is there missed opportunity, where is there waste, where is there time wasted, money wasted in how you partner from party to party. And thinking, look, is there a way that we could put some commercial incentives around things to collectively go after waste? The final topic I talked about is just end-to-end collaboration. So again, as I said before, we think this is a super important and complex industry. One of the things that makes it so complex is just the mess of stakeholders involved, not just all the different players in the value chain, but different municipalities and environmental interests and different business interests and real estate developers, all sorts of different things. I would just encourage you to do even more, building on what you've already done here on collaboration across those lines. It's just an example of some work that we saw recently that we were involved in Toronto. That I wanted to share because I thought it might be relevant. Obviously, airports have a lot of analogies to what you guys are dealing with, and they came to us because they were really they saw a clear, at least the Toronto airport saw a clear need to expand and saw that within 20 years they were not going to have the core sort of capacity to support the air travel demands of the region. But they felt like every time they sort of try to develop some solutions and put things in place, they'd run into one roadblock or another. There's obviously a tremendous amount of constituencies that would weigh in on something like that. And they sort of invested in a real kind of drawn out, in fact, it was almost an 18-month process where they really kind of built a fact base and went out and spent real time with all those different stakeholders, the regional airports that they compete with, the environmental and other industry interests that they sometimes are at odds with, and built a fact base as to what are the real, what's going on, what are your interests, how could we solve this for you? And they actually built a group, they built a consortium that still meets today, and they've been able to align on a shared vision of what they want to do, and they've got different stakeholders actually rowing in the same direction. And so I thought it might be it's been an inspiring story for me, because I've seen so many of my clients in this space around the world struggle with this idea of how do I get different stakeholders aligned. And I think you've got some neighbors to the west that did some pretty interesting stuff that they're really excited about and proud of.
You mentioned that customers would 10 years ago leave the lines for $20. I think this is still today the case, and maybe not in the past as much, but it's still as much or even more today. They leave for $20, $30. The question is, when you have a value-added service, how much is the customer willing to pay? $30, $40, $50, but definitely not much more. So it's not 10 years ago, it's still very much today.
Yeah, I mean, I am sure everyone is feeling cost pressure, right? The growth story that we shared around ports and shipping, there's a lot of industries, a lot of sectors that also have challenges on the growth side, and when you don't have growth, you got to figure out things on the cost side. I will say that what I see much less of is the individual rate, right? I do think that when I've seen companies, be it rail or carriers or logistics, be able to talk about here's your total cost of ownership. Because remember, what's changed also, and this is partly the fault of friends of mine, is that a lot of these procurement departments have been developed, and these procurement departments have this sort of professional approach to say, okay, how do I think through this, right? And yeah, at the end, they also bring a lot of facts, and they can be painful in negotiations. And so, on behalf of my friends who aren't here, I apologize for that. But the one thing they do is that they really do push to install a total cost of ownership approach and mindset, which allows you to kind of bring people from the retail side and the manufacturing side and the logistics side together to say, what's the total cost? And so, yeah, I think if the total cost is really all the math that's clear and there's no differentiation on revenue and it nets net, it's $20 a box cheaper to go with someone else, they probably will do it, right? In some industries. I think what's different is that it's not just on the single rate anymore, for what it's worth. Well, hey, sounds like we're out of time, but thank you very much again for the opportunity. Really enjoyed being up here, and thanks.